Welcome back. Part 3. The Origin and Evolution of Life. Life can be roughly defined as an organism that can reproduce itself and that has the ability to evolve. We cannot go back in time and see how life began, but our best guess is that it started in the warm ocean, where carbon atoms could form molecules, which could then float around and interact with one another, eventually forming complex DNA molecules with the ability to replicate themselves. This is a purely chemical process, no spark of life needed. In 1953, Crick, Watson and Rosalind Franklin constructed the double helix model of the DNA molecule. DNA was seen for the first time in 2012, using an electron microscope. Every living cell contains a copy of its DNA arranged inside pairs of chromosomes. This video shows a cell dividing. Notice how the chromosomes create a copy of themselves before splitting apart. And this video shows that DNA is the code used to build living organisms.
DNA itself is a double helix, like a twisted ladder. It is made up of 4 letters or bases called adenine, cytosine, guanine and thymine, A, C, G and T. A always pairs with T and C always pairs with G. The order or sequence of these letters of DNA carry the instructions for how a cell behaves and functions. Specific sections of the DNA, called genes, carry the instructions for producing molecules. The human genome contains about 23,000 genes. You can think of the genome as an encyclopedia and the chromosomes as the books that make up the set. If you were to print out all 3 billion letters of the human genome, you would make 120 books.
Although the concept of some form of evolution had been considered in ancient Greece, it was Darwin who proposed that all life evolved from a single ancestor, shown in this rough sketch of the tree of life. In his book, On the Origin of Species, he describes the process of evolution, where life adapts to changing circumstances, known as survival of the fittest, eventually forming new species. Darwin proposed this theory of natural selection after collecting and comparing an immense number of animals. Here is one of his collection of beetles. And by observing selective breeding of livestock, such as these fancy pigeons, and through his travels abroad, including the Galapagos Islands, where the flightless cormorant is found. In his later more controversial book, The Descent of Man, Darwin explains how all humans have descended from a common ancestor of ourselves and the apes. He also describes the nature of sexual selection. The theory of evolution is as true as any other scientific theory. It explains all of the available evidence. Importantly, this includes evidence from independent fields of inquiry, such as DNA, fossil records, fetal development, geology, and so on. Here are a few examples. Fossils can be dated by the layer of rock in which they are found. Older rocks contain older fossils. The time sequence of fossils is clear evidence that evolution took place over a vast, incomprehensible period of time. Human embryos start off looking like fish embryos. Their branchial arches become gills in fish and the pharynx in humans. This is further evidence that fish and humans stem from a common ancestor. Whales have inherited a useless pelvis from one of its ancestors. Like Pakicetus. And some babies are born with a tail. Inherited from reptiles. Evolution builds on the inherited DNA of older organisms, which can lead to bad design. For example, humans have evolved large brains, but women have inherited small pelvises that can result in childbirth mortality. If women's pelvises were bigger, however, they would not be able to walk properly. It's a bit like building the next version of Microsoft Windows on top of the previous one. And we all know what that led to. The more DNA species share, the closer they are related. The Human Genome Project has shown that humans share 99.9% of DNA on average. Our closest primate relatives share 96% of our DNA. Different species share genes that have a similar function. For example, fruit flies, mice, and humans share a gene that instructs them to grow eyes. Copying DNA from cell to cell sometimes produces errors, called mutations. Some mutations make the organism better adapted to the environment, and therefore more likely to survive. Others do not, like this fruit fly with legs instead of antennae. Some mutations are fatal, as in cancer. And if all this hasn't convinced you, watch these bacteria evolving in real time.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
This is why we need to limit the use of antibiotics. The theory of evolution is more than just a theory. It is a tried and tested scientific theory, and is the only credible explanation of life. Those who say that evolution is just a theory simply don't understand the scientific method. Humans evolved brains that have enabled us to change much faster than the normal evolutionary process. In this sense, we have transcended evolution.
What took you so long?
Here are some of the books used in writing this session. Our next session is about belief. You can view the entire course online at Zeta2SciencePart3. Try the quiz that follows. There are also some issues for discussion.